Preston Woods, 39, repaired elevators in Pittsburgh hospitals, while his wife sold luxury furniture to people who never learned his name. Most assumed Preston was broke. The worn boots, the rusted truck, the gas station coffee at midnight made that easy to believe. What nobody knew was that he had quietly erased $300,000 of debt tied to Vanessa Holloway's family. The last payment cleared at 4:12 p.m. By 7:40, Preston walked into his house and saw Vanessa dragging a suitcase toward the front door. Before we continue, comment your country and local time below. And if you enjoy grounded stories about betrayal, patience, and quiet revenge, subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow's story might change the way you look at silence. 3 years earlier, Preston Woods still believed silence could hold a marriage together. The apartment on Pioneer Avenue in Brookline smelled like radiator heat and burnt coffee most winters. It sat above a barber shop with flickering red neon that buzzed all night long. The kitchen floor tilted slightly toward the sink. The pipes knocked every morning around 6:30 when the old woman downstairs showered before work. Vanessa hated that apartment. She never said it directly at first. She just opened luxury home listings on her phone during dinner. Bigger kitchens, marble countertops, clean white staircases in Sewickley Heights, where doctors and corporate attorneys lived behind stone gates and trimmed hedges. Preston noticed everything. He simply chose not to react to most of it. That February, Pittsburgh got hit with freezing rain that coated the roads in silver ice. Preston had just finished a 14-hour shift repairing an elevator control panel at UPMC Mercy Hospital when Vanessa called him at 1:17 in the morning. Her voice sounded strange, tight, controlled. "My mom's in the ER." Preston drove straight there without going home. The emergency waiting room smelled like disinfectant and wet coats. Nurses pushed rolling carts through automatic doors, while tired families stared at muted television screens mounted near the ceiling. Preston found Vanessa sitting beside her father near the vending machines. Douglas Holloway looked smaller than usual. That was the first thing Preston noticed. Douglas normally carried himself like a man performing for invisible investors. Perfect shoes, loud opinions, expensive watches bought on credit. Even during family cookouts, he spoke like somebody pitching a business merger. But that night, his shoulders sagged. Linda Holloway had suffered another cardiac episode. Complications, medication changes, more tests, more bills. Vanessa rubbed her hands together while staring at the tile floor. "We're fine," she said, before Preston even asked. That sentence alone told him they weren't. Around 4 in the morning, Douglas stepped outside to take a call. Vanessa went to the restroom. Preston remained alone near the chairs when he noticed the folder sitting beside Douglas's coat. White envelopes spilled halfway out. Final notices. Past due statements. Bank warnings. He should have looked away. Instead, he quietly pulled one paper free. First National Bank of Pennsylvania. Outstanding commercial balance, $187,430. Another envelope carried the logo of a medical collections agency. Another belonged to a flooring supplier in Cleveland. Another listed overdue payroll taxes Tied to Holloway fine furniture. Preston slowly slid the papers back into place. When Vanessa returned, she immediately saw something had changed in his face. What? Nothing. You look worried. I'm tired. She studied him for another second before sitting back down. Preston didn't ask questions there. He waited. He always waited. 2 days later, Vanessa came home late from work carrying Thai takeout containers and a tension headache. She kicked off her heels near the couch and stood silently in the kitchen while Preston reheated leftover soup. Finally, she spoke, without looking at him. My dad's business is having cash flow issues. Cash flow issues. People with real money always used soft phrases for disasters. Preston placed the spoon down carefully. How bad? Vanessa crossed her arms. They'll recover. That bad. She looked irritated now. Why are you making it sound dramatic? Because hospitals did not send collection agencies after stable families. Because men like Douglas Holloway did not suddenly stop bragging unless something underneath them was collapsing. Preston sat quietly while Vanessa paced near the refrigerator. Finally, she exhaled hard. My parents refinanced the showroom 2 years ago. Then Mom got sick again. Tyler's company failed. Dad started borrowing against inventory to stay open. How much? Vanessa hesitated too long. That. Told him the number before she said it. Almost 300,000. The apartment suddenly felt smaller. Outside snow slid down the fire escape in heavy sheets. Vanessa leaned against the counter and spoke quickly now, almost defensively. You can't tell anyone, especially not Tyler. Dad would die if people knew. Preston looked at her for several seconds. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Are they going to lose the house? Vanessa looked away. That answer was yes. Over the next few weeks, details surfaced slowly. Douglas had borrowed against the furniture showroom in Cranberry Township. Linda's medical bills kept growing despite insurance. Tyler Holloway had burned through nearly $80,000 trying to launch a freight brokerage company, with 2 college friends who disappeared once the money dried up. Minimum payments became impossible. Interest multiplied, then suppliers started demanding cash up front. Preston listened, without interruption, each night, while Vanessa unraveled piece after piece of the disaster. What struck him most was not the debt itself. It was the fear. Vanessa lived with constant fear of embarrassment. Fear that friends in Sewickley would discover the truth. Fear that her parents would lose the image they spent 20 years building. One night, Preston woke around 2:30 in the morning and found her sitting alone at the kitchen table. The laptop screen illuminated unpaid invoices scattered beside a calculator. She was crying silently. Not dramatically, not loudly, just exhausted. Preston stood in the hallway, watching for a moment before walking over. Vanessa immediately wiped her face. I'm okay. He nodded once. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and began reading the paperwork, line by line. Loan balance collection notices, medical payment plans, interest rates, deadlines. By sunrise, he understood the structure of the entire collapse. And somewhere around 6:15 that morning, while the first city buses groaned through icy streets outside Preston, made a decision he would never fully explain to anyone. He would fix it. Not because Douglas deserved rescuing, not because Tyler had earned forgiveness, and not because Vanessa asked him to. She never did. Preston simply could not sit across from the woman he loved every night and watch fear slowly hollow her out from the inside. So he started making calls, quietly. A week later, after finishing another overnight maintenance shift downtown, Preston parked outside a small brick office building near Grant Street. The gold lettering on the glass door read, Shaw and Bentley Financial Law. Inside, a woman in a charcoal suit waited beside stacks of folders, arranged with surgical precision. Evelyn Shaw did not waste time with greetings. You're talking about assuming nearly $300,000 in distressed debt, she said. If you do this incorrectly, you could destroy your own financial future. Preston slid the paperwork across the desk. I'm not asking how to avoid it. Evelyn opened the folder. I'm asking how to survive it. She studied him carefully then. Not his clothes, not the worn work boots, the calm. Most people looked panicked when discussing money at that level. Preston looked like a man preparing for weather. Evelyn leaned back slightly. If we do this, she said, everything must be documented. Every transfer, every signature, every protection. Preston nodded once. Outside, snow drifted across Grant Street under the gray Pittsburgh sky while Evelyn pulled the first contract from her drawer. And for the first time, the debt officially became his. The first thing Preston sacrificed was sleep. The second was comfort. Everything else disappeared gradually after that. For almost 3 years, his life became a cycle of elevators, fluorescent lighting, and coffee strong enough to keep his hands steady at 4 a.m. Pittsburgh looked different during overnight shifts. Downtown emptied after midnight, except for ambulances, snowplows, and exhausted workers smoking outside loading docks. Preston spent most nights inside service corridors, beneath hospitals and office towers, where nobody cared about appearances, only whether the elevators worked. At UPMC Presbyterian, he repaired emergency brake assemblies while surgeons operated 8 floors above him. At the Fairmont Hotel downtown, he reset jammed control systems after drunk convention guests overloaded elevators at 2 a.m. At Allegheny General, he once worked 19 straight hours. After a power fluctuation, trapped 3 nurses between floors during a thunderstorm. He rarely complained. There was no energy left for complaining. Around dawn, he usually sat alone inside his truck near the Monongahela River and ate breakfast from a plastic container, while steam rose from sewer grates into the winter air. Turkey sandwich, protein bar, black coffee from Speedway. Always the same. Preston became careful with every dollar. He stopped buying takeout, stopped replacing old clothes, stopped going out with co-workers after shifts. When the transmission in his Ford F-150 began slipping, he learned how to rebuild part of it himself through repair manuals and YouTube videos watched at 2 times speed. Vanessa noticed some of it. Not all. What happened to your boots? She asked one night. The soles were peeling loose near the toes. They're fine. You said that 3 months ago. Preston shrugged and kept eating. Vanessa stared at him from across the apartment table. "You work too much." He almost laughed at that. Instead, he asked, "How's your mom doing?" That redirected the conversation exactly where he wanted it. Linda Holloway's condition stabilized slowly over the next year, but the bills never truly stopped. New medications replaced old ones. Insurance disputes dragged across months. Specialists demanded upfront payments before appointments. Every time another notice appeared, Preston quietly handled it through Evelyn Shaw's office. Structured payments, debt renegotiations, settlement agreements. Everything documented. Everything controlled. Evelyn insisted on precision. "You are not throwing money into a fire," she told him during one meeting. "You're building a legal position. Remember that." At first, Preston barely understood what she meant. Then she began showing him patterns, showing him Douglas Holloway had terrible financial instincts. He refinanced emotionally, borrowed emotionally, signed things emotionally. Men like that collapsed because they kept pretending tomorrow would save them. Preston approached problems differently. He prepared. He tracked every transfer in spreadsheets late at night while Vanessa slept. He kept copies of every payment confirmation in locked folders labeled by date and creditor. He never imagined those records would someday matter beyond the debt itself. But Evelyn did. "You're protecting yourself," she reminded him repeatedly. Meanwhile, Vanessa drifted further away. Not suddenly, gradually, like somebody stepping backward into fog. At first, it showed up in small comments. "You still drive that thing? Do you ever think about doing something bigger? My friend Alyssa's husband just made partner downtown." Preston usually answered with silence, not because he lacked words, because arguments consumed energy he needed elsewhere. One Friday evening, Vanessa invited him to a networking party at a rooftop bar downtown. Most guests worked in corporate law finance or commercial real estate. Preston almost declined after a 14-hour shift, but Vanessa insisted. "You never come with me anywhere." So he showered, put on his only dark blazer, and went. The rooftop overlooked the Allegheny River. Sting lights reflected against glass towers, while waiters carried trays of bourbon cocktails through crowds dressed in expensive wool coats. Preston immediately felt out of place. Not insecure, just observant. Men there shook hands too long, laughed too loudly, mentioned investment portfolios within 3 minutes of introductions. Vanessa transformed around them. Her posture changed. Her smile sharpened. She laughed, faster, touched people's arms while talking, tilted herself toward conversations that sounded expensive. That was where Preston first met Grant Carlisle. Grant looked engineered for corporate advertisements. Early 40s, perfect haircut, navy overcoat tailored close at the shoulders, a silver Rolex partially visible beneath his cuff every time he lifted his drink. Corporate litigation attorney, Carlisle and Boone. Downtown office overlooking Market Square. Grant shook Preston's hand politely, but without curiosity. "What line of work are you in elevator systems?" Grant nodded once. Conversation finished. 10 seconds later, He was discussing private equity with someone else. Vanessa noticed none of it, or pretended not to. On the drive home, snow drifted lightly across the windshield while jazz played softly through the truck speakers. "You could have talked more tonight," Vanessa said. Preston kept his eyes on the road. "I talked. You know what I mean." He did. Vanessa wanted performance. Ambition spoken out loud. The kind of confidence men like Grant Carlyle wore naturally. Preston had never learned how to advertise himself. A few weeks later, she mentioned Grant again, while folding laundry. "He's representing a hotel developer downtown. Apparently, he billed $900 an hour last year." Preston nodded without interest. Vanessa watched him carefully. "Does that bother you?" "No." "You don't care that other people are more successful?" Preston finally looked up from the dishwasher. "Success isn't usually as loud as people think." Vanessa rolled her eyes slightly. That tiny movement stayed with him longer than the conversation itself. By the second year, the marriage felt uneven in ways Preston could not repair with money or patience. Vanessa spent more evenings out with coworkers, more client dinners, more weekends at networking events. Sometimes she came home smelling like expensive restaurant wine and downtown hotel perfume. Preston never accused her of anything. He simply watched. One rainy Tuesday, near the end of October, Preston finished repairing a malfunctioning freight elevator at St. Clair Hospital around 1:40 in the morning. His hands smelled like machine oil and burned wiring insulation. Rain hammered against the parking garage roof while he sat inside his truck checking work orders on his phone. That was when Vanessa's screen lit up on the dashboard Bluetooth system. A message preview appeared automatically. Grant Carlyle. Still thinking about tonight. Preston stared at the glowing screen while rainwater slid across the windshield in silver streams. Another message arrived seconds later. "You deserve more than that apartment." The cab remained completely silent, except for ticking engine noise. Preston did not pick up the phone, did not scroll further, did not call Vanessa. Instead, he leaned back slowly against the driver's seat and closed his eyes for a moment, not from shock, from exhaustion, because deep down, some part of him had already seen this coming long before the messages appeared. People revealed themselves gradually, in fragments, a sentence here, a look there, the way Vanessa had started introducing him less often at events, the way she paused before mentioning his job, the way her eyes lingered around men who carried themselves like money solved everything. Preston opened his eyes again and looked toward the hospital entrance, where exhausted nurses rotated through automatic doors under fluorescent light. Then he reached into the center console and pulled out a folded payment schedule from Evelyn Shaw's office. Remaining balance owed across all Holloway debt $74,218. Almost finished. 3 years of overtime. 3 years of hidden transfers. 3 years of carrying a family that barely noticed the shoulders underneath them. Preston folded the paper carefully and placed it back inside the console. Then he started the truck. And somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion, a quiet realization settled into place. By the time Vanessa finally understood what kind of man she had married, it might already be too late. The Holloway house in Swickley Heights sat behind a curved stone wall lined with trimmed evergreen shrubs that stayed perfectly shaped through every season. Douglas Holloway cared about appearances more than comfort. The driveway alone could fit 6 cars. Bronze lanterns glowed beside the front entrance, even before sunset. Inside, soft jazz drifted through hidden ceiling speakers, while expensive candles masked the smell of old wood polish and anxiety. Preston parked his aging Ford F-150 beside a black Mercedes S-Class, already sitting near the fountain. Grant Carlyle had arrived before them. Vanessa noticed the truck reflection in the Mercedes door the moment they stepped out. "You could have borrowed a nicer vehicle from work," she muttered quietly. Preston shut the truck door without answering. Cold November wind moved through the trees while he adjusted the cuff of his faded dark coat. His knuckles still carried thin healing cuts from replacing elevator cables earlier that morning at McGee Women's Hospital. Vanessa walked ahead toward the house in heels, too thin for the stone pathway. She did not wait for him. Inside, warmth rushed outward from the oversized foyer fireplace. Douglas Holloway stood near the dining room, holding a glass of bourbon while talking loudly about commercial property taxes with Grant Carlyle. Grant looked perfectly placed in that environment. Gray, tailored suit, polished brown shoes, relaxed smile. The kind of man who never appeared tired. "Preston," Douglas said, as if surprised he had actually come. "Still fixing elevators. Still riding them," Preston answered. Douglas laughed harder than the joke deserved. Grant extended a hand politely. "Good seeing you again." Preston shook it once. Grant's grip felt practiced. Controlled pressure. Controlled eye contact. Everything measured. Men like Grant spent their entire lives learning how to make people trust them quickly. Linda Holloway appeared from the kitchen carrying a tray of appetizers. Her health had improved enough that the color finally returned to her face. The expensive medication Preston quietly paid for every month was working. "You look exhausted," she told Preston softly. "Long week." "That man works too hard," Douglas announced while dropping ice cubes into his bourbon glass. "I keep telling Vanessa she married a machine." Vanessa forced a small smile. Nobody in the room noticed Preston watching Douglas carefully. The man had gained weight back recently. Stress no longer hollowed out his face the way it once had. The collection calls had stopped. The mortgage notices stopped too. The pressure had eased. Because Preston carried it now. Dinner started shortly after 7. Long walnut table, crystal glasses, steaks from some expensive butcher downtown. Tyler Holloway arrived 20 minutes late, wearing a designer quarter-zip sweater and the expression of a man permanently recovering from his own bad decisions. Traffic was brutal, Tyler announced while tossing his car keys onto the counter. Preston knew Tyler's leased BMW had nearly been repossessed 14 months earlier. He also knew the overdue balance currently keeping that from happening. Tyler sat beside Grant almost immediately. The conversation shifted toward business. Always business in that house. Commercial real estate, interest rates, private investment groups, downtown expansion projects. Preston ate quietly while listening, not withdrawn, observant. He noticed how often Vanessa leaned toward Grant when he spoke, how quickly she laughed around him compared to everyone else, how Grant never interrupted her mid-sentence the way Douglas and Tyler often did. Grant understood presentation. That all made him dangerous. So Preston, Tyler said, eventually cutting into his steak, "When are you going to stop crawling through elevator shafts and start your own company?" Vanessa lowered her eyes toward her plate. Douglas smirked faintly into his drink. Preston wiped his mouth with a napkin before answering. "I already have work." "That's not what I mean," Tyler replied. "I'm talking about real money." Preston looked at him calmly. Tyler wore a gold watch Preston had indirectly helped pay for through debt restructuring 6 months earlier. But Tyler didn't know that. None of them did. Grant leaned back slightly in his chair. "There's nothing wrong with skilled trades," he said smoothly. "Honestly, most white-collar guys couldn't survive a week doing physical work." It sounded complimentary. It also sounded like someone discussing construction equipment. Preston nodded once. "True," Douglas chuckled. "Still, Vanessa always had expensive taste. Remember that sweetheart? Even in high school." Vanessa laughed lightly. "Dad?" "No, I'm serious," Douglas continued. "She used to tape photos of Manhattan penthouses onto her bedroom wall." Grant smiled at that. Preston noticed. Of course he noticed. Outside, snow began drifting across the backyard pool lights in slow white spirals. Inside, the conversation kept circling status. Who bought what? Who vacationed where? Who invested in which property? Grant described a luxury condo project near the Strip District, while Tyler listened, like a teenager, hearing stories about celebrities. Meanwhile, Preston calculated numbers silently in his head. Remaining debt balance after next month's scheduled transfer, $41,903. Almost there. 3 years compressed into spreadsheets, overtime shifts, and hidden bank transfers. At one point, Linda asked Preston quietly, "Are you still taking those overnight hospital contracts?" "Yes." "You need rest." "I'm fine." Vanessa looked at him then, not with concern, with irritation, as if exhaustion itself embarrassed her now. The feeling passed quickly across her face, but Preston caught it. He always caught those things. After dinner, everyone moved into the sitting room overlooking the backyard. Douglas poured another round of drinks, while Grant discussed a litigation case involving a failed hotel acquisition. Vanessa sat beside him on the couch. Too close. Not inappropriate enough for accusation. Just familiar enough to settle coldly in Preston's chest. Tyler turned toward Preston with a grin. "You know what your problem is?" Preston looked over. "You never sell yourself." "Maybe." "No, seriously," Tyler continued. "Guys like Grant understand image, success, connections. You act like none of that matters." Grant gave a modest shrug. "I think consistency matters more." Interesting choice of word. Consistency, not loyalty, not integrity. Consistency sounded clean, without requiring sacrifice. Preston glanced toward the giant floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the property. The house looked impressive from inside. Warm lights, stone landscaping, luxury furniture. Everything stable, everything saved. Paid for one silent transfer at a time by the man sitting unnoticed near the edge of the room. Douglas suddenly raised his glass. To survival. Everyone echoed it casually. Only Preston understood how literal the toast actually was. His phone vibrated once inside his coat pocket. He checked the screen discreetly. First National Bank. Final restructuring review approved. He stared at the message for one extra second. That was the largest remaining commercial balance connected to Holloway Fine Furniture. The final wall before the entire structure stopped collapsing. Evelyn Shaw had warned him this moment would come. The point where he finished carrying people who never realized they were being carried. Grant continued speaking nearby, while Vanessa watched him with open admiration now. Preston slowly locked his phone screen again. Linda walked over quietly and touched his arm. You okay, Preston? Yeah. You look far away tonight. He glanced around the room once more. Douglas laughing loudly beside the fireplace. Tyler talking about investment apps he barely understood. Vanessa smiling at another man. Grant perfectly comfortable inside a life Preston had secretly financed. Then Preston looked back at Linda, just tired. And for the first time in years, the exhaustion no longer felt temporary. The snow started before dawn and stayed all day. By 4 in the afternoon downtown, Pittsburgh looked washed in gray and white. Slush gathered along curbs. Pedestrians walked faster, with shoulders hunched against the wind. Brake lights reflected across wet streets like broken red ribbons. Preston Woods parked outside First National Bank of Pennsylvania and sat in his truck for nearly 2 full minutes before getting out. Not because he was uncertain, because he was tired enough to feel it in his bones. 3 years. 3 years of overtime shifts, skipped weekends, repaired machinery, hidden transfers, and carefully managed silence had brought him to this parking spot. The envelope resting on the passenger seat contained the final numbers. He picked it up and stepped into the cold. Inside, the bank smelled like polished marble and burnt coffee from the customer waiting area. Holiday decorations had already gone up around the lobby, even though Thanksgiving was still a week away. Gold ribbons wrapped around artificial pine garlands near the teller counters. People smiled more during the holidays. Even banks pretended warmth. A young associate in a navy blazer recognized him immediately. Mr. Woods Preston nodded once. Mr. Hargrove is expecting you. He followed her through glass doors toward a private office overlooking Grant Street. Richard Hargrove stood as Preston entered. Mid-50s, silver tie, calm eyes behind rectangular glasses. Over the past 3 years, Hargrove had watched Preston slowly erase a collapsing mountain of debt, one payment at a time. Most clients who dealt with distressed balances arrived emotional, desperate, loud. Preston never raised his voice once. Hargrove respected that. Long road, the banker said quietly. Preston sat across from the desk. Yeah. Hargrove opened the file. The stack had grown thinner over time. Fewer balances, fewer notices, fewer dangers waiting behind paperwork. Now, only one remained. Commercial restructuring balance, $41,900. $3.27. Hargrove rotated the monitor slightly. Once this clears, he said the Holloway accounts will officially close in good standing. Preston looked at the number. For a second, memories threw him in fragments. Linda Holloway sitting in a hospital bed under fluorescent light. Vanessa crying quietly over unpaid invoices at the kitchen table. Tyler bragging about investments, while Preston covered his disasters behind the scenes. 3 years compressed into one final transfer. You ready? Hargrove asked. Preston removed his phone. Do it. The wire transfer took less than 30 seconds. One tap. One confirmation code. One final authorization. That was all. Machines ended things much faster than people did. Hargrove printed the confirmation receipt and slid it across the desk. Paid in full. The words sat there plainly, beneath account numbers and timestamps. No music played. No applause. No relief exploded through Preston's chest, the way movies pretended it would. Mostly he felt empty, like a man who had been carrying something heavy. For so long his body no longer understood how to stand without it. Hargrove leaned back slightly. You saved them, he said. Preston folded the receipt once. They saved themselves. It wasn't true. Both men knew that. But Preston had never been comfortable discussing his own sacrifices out loud. As he stood to leave, Hargrove spoke again. You know, most people would have demanded recognition. Preston slid the folded receipt into his jacket pocket. Recognition from who? Outside snow struck his face sharply the moment he exited the building. Traffic crawled through downtown. Sirens echoed somewhere near Liberty Avenue. Preston climbed back into his truck and rested both hands on the steering wheel for several seconds. Finished. The debt was gone. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think about something beyond survival. Maybe a better apartment. Maybe fewer overnight shifts. Maybe finally telling Vanessa the truth. Not to impress her. Just because marriages were not supposed to survive on silence forever. His phone buzzed while the heater slowly pushed warm air through the vents. Evelyn Shaw. He answered immediately. It's done, Preston said. I saw the transfer. No, brushed against the windshield, in soft streaks, while traffic lights reflected across wet glass. Evelyn's voice remained calm and precise, as always. Keep every receipt. I know. I'm serious, Preston. Don't throw anything away. He leaned his head lightly against the seat. You still think this is going to become a legal issue? I think preparation matters, Evelyn answered, especially when emotions eventually catch up to money. Preston watched a city bus drag through slush nearby. You think I should tell Vanessa tonight? A pause. Then Evelyn spoke carefully. I think you should decide whether you want gratitude or honesty. What's the difference? Gratitude disappears fast, she said. Honesty doesn't. The line went quiet for a moment. Finally, Preston said, I'll figure it out. After hanging up, he drove toward Brookline through worsening snow. The truck heater rattled loudly now, another repair waiting for money he no longer needed to send elsewhere. He stopped once at a red light near Mount Washington Overlook. Downtown Pittsburgh glowed beneath the snowfall. Bridges stretched across dark rivers, while office towers disappeared into gray sky. Preston realized he had barely seen the city during daylight in years. He had lived underneath it instead. Basements, service corridors, machine rooms, freight elevators. The hidden infrastructure that kept buildings functioning while everyone above ignored what held them up. That thought stayed with him during the drive home. By the time he reached Pioneer Avenue, night had fully settled over the neighborhood. Snow covered parked cars in uneven white layers. The barber shop downstairs had already closed its red neon sign, buzzing faintly through the storm. Preston climbed the apartment stairs carrying nothing except the folded bank receipt inside his jacket pocket. For once, he wasn't rehearsing another excuse for overtime, wasn't calculating another payment schedule, wasn't preparing another sacrifice. He simply wanted to go home. The apartment lights were on. That surprised him. Vanessa usually worked late Thursdays. Preston unlocked the door and stepped inside. Silence. No television. No music. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft scrape of luggage wheels across hardwood flooring. He froze. Vanessa stood near the hallway, wearing a camel-colored coat. Her silver suitcase rested beside the front door. Another smaller bag sat near the couch. The apartment smelled faintly of her perfume and freshly packed clothes. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Preston noticed details automatically. The missing picture frame near the bookshelf. The empty hook where Vanessa kept her spare keys. The half-cleared bathroom counter visible down the hallway. Prepared, not impulsive. She had planned this. Vanessa finally looked at him fully. Her expression wasn't angry. That would have been easier. Instead, she looked resolved, like someone already emotionally gone long before physically leaving. "You're home early," she said quietly. Preston shut the door behind him. Snow melted slowly from his boots onto the floorboards. "What's going on?" Vanessa crossed her arms tightly against herself. For the first time all evening, Preston felt the folded bank receipt pressing lightly against his chest, inside the jacket pocket. Paid in full. 3 years. Everything finished barely 2 hours earlier. Vanessa inhaled carefully. Then she said the sentence Preston would replay in his head for months afterward. "I can't do this anymore." The strange thing was how calm the apartment looked, while a marriage ended inside it. Snow tapped softly against the windows. The kitchen light above the sink still flickered every few minutes, the way it always had. Preston's work boots left wet marks across the hardwood floor, while the radiator hissed unevenly near the couch. Nothing dramatic. No shouting, No broken dishes. Just Vanessa, standing beside two suitcases, with her coat already on. Preston removed his gloves, slowly, and placed them on the kitchen counter. How long have you been planning this? Vanessa looked away first. A while. He nodded once. That answer fit the evidence. The cleared bathroom shelves, the missing framed photos, the empty side of the closet he hadn't fully noticed until now. Preston hung his jacket carefully over the dining chair. The folded bank receipt remained inside the pocket. He still had not touched it. Vanessa crossed her arms tighter. You're not even going to ask why I think I already know. That irritated her immediately. There you go again. What? That? She gestured toward him with frustration building beneath her voice. You act like nothing affects you. Preston leaned lightly against the kitchen counter. Everything affected him. He simply believed emotions became dangerous once they escaped control. Vanessa paced a few steps across the living room. I can't keep living like this, Preston. Like what, in survival mode all the time? He almost answered instinctively. We survived because I made sure your family did. But the words stopped before reaching his mouth. Not yet. Vanessa turned toward the apartment around them. The tiny apartment. The overnight shifts. The constant exhaustion. You disappear into work and barely exist when you're home. Preston watched her quietly. You think I wanted that? I think you got comfortable with it. That landed harder than she realized. Because comfort had nothing to do with the last 3 years. Preston remembered sleeping inside hospital maintenance rooms between emergency calls. Remembered eating cold sandwiches at 3 in the morning because every extra dollar mattered. Remembered watching his own savings account drain month after month while Vanessa talked about rooftop bars and luxury condos. Comfort. The word almost felt insulting. Still, as kept his voice even. What do you want me to say? Vanessa stopped pacing. For once, I want you to care enough to fight for something. Preston looked directly at her then. I did. She frowned slightly. The sentence passed over her without understanding. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the apartment ceiling as a car turned down Pioneer Avenue. Vanessa inhaled slowly. There's someone else. There it was. Not shocking, not even surprising anymore, just final. Preston lowered his eyes briefly toward the floorboards. How long? A few months. Grant, Carlisle, of course. Preston imagined the polished Mercedes outside expensive restaurants downtown, the rooftop bars, the conversations about ambition and success and bigger futures. Grant represented movement. Preston represented endurance, and endurance rarely looked glamorous. Vanessa spoke more quickly now, as if momentum made honesty easier. He listens to me. Preston said nothing. He understands the kind of life I actually want. Still, nothing. Her frustration returned almost immediately. Why are you so calm? Because panic changes nothing. Because anger solves nothing. Because exhausted men often run out of visible reactions long before they run out of pain. But Preston only answered, what would yelling accomplish? Vanessa stared at him like that response itself proved her point. You know what your problem is. she asked quietly. You never needed more. That wasn't true either. Preston had wanted plenty. A house someday. Children, maybe. Rest, peace. He had simply traded those wants for responsibilities nobody else would carry. Vanessa picked up the smaller suitcase. I'm staying somewhere else tonight. With Grant, a pause. Then yes. The honesty at least deserved acknowledgement. Preston nodded once. Neither of them spoke for several seconds afterward. The apartment suddenly sounded smaller than ever. Refrigerator hum. Pipe noise. Wind brushing snow against the windows. Vanessa walked toward the door, but stopped before opening it. I didn't mean for this to happen. Preston believed that part. Most betrayals started long before people admitted them to themselves. 1,000 tiny decisions. 1,000 quiet permissions. Grant probably entered her life as relief first, then attention, then comparison. Comparison killed more marriages than hatred ever did. Vanessa turned back toward him. You deserve someone simpler than me. Preston almost smiled at that. Simpler. As if complexity was measured by income brackets and cocktail conversations. He looked at her carefully now. The expensive coat, the polished makeup, the exhaustion hidden underneath both. 3 years earlier, she had cried quietly over medical debt at the kitchen table, while Preston built a shield around her entire family, one payment at a time. Now she stood near the front door, preparing to leave the man who made sure those fears disappeared. And she still did not know. That realization settled strangely inside him. Not rage. Something colder. The understanding that love without awareness eventually becomes blindness. Vanessa reached for the doorknob. Preston. He waited. I hope someday you understand. That finally pulled a small reaction from him. Not anger, just disbelief. Because understanding was exactly what had destroyed him. He understood too much. Understood every unpaid bill before she did. Understood every hidden panic attack her father concealed behind bourbon and business talk. Understood Tyler's failures before Tyler himself admitted them. Understood Vanessa's growing disappointment months before she voiced it aloud. Understanding had cost him nearly everything. But he only said, "Drive safe." Vanessa's face tightened slightly. Maybe some part of her expected pleading, or confrontation, or jealousy, loud enough to prove she still mattered. Instead, she got calm. Controlled. The same calm that had carried Preston through collapsing elevators, emergency repairs, and 3 years of financial pressure. Outside, a car door opened. Grant was waiting. Preston heard it without looking. Vanessa opened the apartment door halfway, then hesitated one final time. You really have nothing else to say. He almost told her then. About the debt, about the payments, about the bank office downtown, only hours earlier. About the words paid in full, folded inside his jacket pocket. He imagined her face changing, shock, guilt, confusion, maybe even regret. But another thought arrived immediately afterward. If the truth only mattered once she was leaving, then maybe it never truly mattered to her at all. So Preston shook his head once. No. Vanessa stared at him for another second before walking out into the snow. The apartment door closed softly behind her. No dramatic slam, just a quiet click. Preston remained motionless for a long time afterward. Then he finally walked toward the window. Grant Carlyle stood beside the black Mercedes parked at the curb. Snowflakes drifted across the streetlights while he loaded Vanessa's luggage into the trunk. Grant glanced toward the apartment once. Not guilty. Victorious. Men like Grant always believed outcomes proved worth. The Mercedes pulled away slowly through the snow-covered street. Its red taillights disappeared at the intersection. Then Preston stood alone inside the apartment he had spent 3 years financially protecting for people who barely saw him. The silence afterward felt enormous. He walked back into the kitchen mechanically and removed his jacket. The folded bank receipt slipped from the pocket onto the table. Preston stared at it. Paid in full. The words looked almost mocking now. 3 years. $300,000. Gone. And less than 3 hours after finishing the final payment, his wife had left with another man. Preston sat down slowly at the kitchen table. Outside, snow continued falling across Pittsburgh in heavy white sheets. Finally, after several minutes, he reached for his phone and opened the contact labeled Evelyn Shaw. His thumb hovered briefly before pressing call. She answered immediately. "It's done," Preston said quietly. A short pause followed. The payment number. He looked toward the empty hallway where Vanessa's belongings used to be. My marriage. And for the first time that night, the exhaustion in his voice sounded heavy enough for someone else to hear it. Divorce moved faster once lawyers became involved. By Monday morning, Preston already had an email from Vanessa requesting formal separation terms. By Wednesday, paperwork arrived at the apartment through certified mail. The timing impressed him. Grant Carlyle wasted very little time. Preston sat alone at the kitchen table while early winter rain struck the windows. Vanessa's side of the closet remained half empty. Her coffee mugs were gone. So were the expensive candles she used to buy from boutique stores downtown. The apartment looked stripped of softness now. Just exposed structure. He opened the envelope carefully. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Request for temporary financial support. Preliminary claim regarding marital assets. Preston read every page slowly. Not emotionally. Precisely. Grant's influence showed immediately. The language framed Vanessa as a woman emotionally abandoned by a husband, consumed with work. It described Preston as distant, unavailable, financially secretive. That last word almost made him laugh. Financially secretive. For 3 years, secrecy had protected the entire Holloway family from humiliation. Now, it was being used against him. Preston folded the papers neatly and checked the time. 8:14 a.m. Then he called Evelyn Shaw. "I assumed this was coming," she said after hearing the details. "You already sound irritated." "I'm a financial attorney, Preston. Irritation is part of the profession. That pulled the smallest hint of amusement from him. When can you meet? 9:30. Bring everything. Everything turned out to mean exactly that. By the time Preston arrived at Shaw and Bentley Financial Law downtown, he carried 2 storage boxes filled with records accumulated across 3 years. Bank statements, wire transfers, medical settlements, signed restructuring agreements, tax documents, commercial liens, every quiet sacrifice preserved in paper form. Evelyn stared at the chun as Preston set them inside her office. You actually kept all of it. You told me to. That may be the smartest decision you've made in your entire life. Outside her office window, Pittsburgh traffic crawled through freezing rain while Evelyn began reviewing the divorce filing. She read quickly. Cold eyes, sharp focus, no wasted motion. Finally, she set the papers down. Grant Carlyle wrote parts of this himself. How can you tell? Because it sounds expensive. Preston leaned back in the chair silently. Evelyn tapped one fingernail against the document. They're asking for shared equity in the house, access to financial accounts, and temporary support based on income estimates. Okay. You don't sound worried. Preston looked toward the rain outside. I'm too tired to panic. Evelyn studied him for a moment before opening another folder. Good. That ruins strategy. She slid several documents across the desk. Now let's discuss what your wife doesn't know. The first document involved the house. 3 years earlier, before Preston and Vanessa married, Evelyn had insisted he place the Brookline property into a protected trust structure connected to a small investment account he inherited from his grandfather. At the time, Preston barely understood why. Now he did. The property technically belongs to the trust, Evelyn explained, not directly to you. That complicates any marital claims significantly. Preston nodded slowly. And the debt payments, Evelyn opened another folder. That stack looked thicker, much thicker. Every payment Preston made toward the Holloway family debt had been structured carefully, not as gifts. Secured family assistance agreements, documented obligations, legally acknowledged restructuring support. Douglas Holloway signed some personally. Tyler signed others. Even Linda's medical payment agreements carried acknowledgement clauses. Preston stared at the paperwork silently. He remembered signing most of it late at night between shifts without fully processing future consequences. At the time, he only cared about stopping the collapse. Evelyn cared about survivability. You protected me without saying it, Preston said quietly. I protected the version of you that would eventually need proof. She leaned back in her chair. People become very creative once divorce starts, especially when money and embarrassment collide. Preston thought about Vanessa leaving with Grant, about the petition describing him as financially secretive, about 3 years disappearing into invisible labor nobody respected because nobody saw it. Then he asked the question that had lingered quietly in his mind since the apartment door closed behind Vanessa. What happens if they find out? Evelyn's expression barely changed. They will? No, I mean all of it. The debt. Evelyn folded her hands calmly. Then the narrative changes. Preston looked down at the paperwork again. $300,000. Every cent mapped across legal documents. Suddenly, the entire marriage looked different, viewed through paper instead of memory. Evelyn continued speaking. Right now, Vanessa believes she left a financially stagnant husband. She did. No, Evelyn corrected softly. She left a man who absorbed financial pressure so efficiently she never experienced the real consequences. That sentence stayed with him because it was true. Vanessa never saw collection agents calling daily, never negotiated with hospitals, never stayed awake calculating interest growth at 2 in the morning. Preston carried all of that privately until stability looked natural. That was the problem with quiet competence. Eventually, people assumed the absence of disaster meant no effort existed underneath it. Evelyn reached for the divorce petition again. There's another issue. What Grant Carlyle? Preston's jaw tightened slightly for the first time all morning. Evelyn noticed. Relax. I'm not talking emotionally. Then what? He's personally involved with your wife while advising her legal strategy. That creates exposure if this becomes hostile. Preston rubbed tired hands across his face. I don't want a war. No one ever does at the beginning. Rain continued streaking down the office windows while Evelyn organized several folders into separate stacks. Finally, she handed Preston a slim, black binder. What's this? Our response. That was fast. I started drafting it the moment you said the word Mercedes. Preston almost smiled again. Almost. Evelyn pointed toward the binder. We're not attacking Vanessa personally. Understand that. I know. We're responding with documentation. Nothing emotional. Nothing theatrical. That's what I want. Good. Because documentation is where your strength lives. Preston opened the binder slowly. Inside sat copies of transfer records arranged chronologically. Dates, amounts, creditor names, signatures. The entire hidden structure of the last 3 years exposed with brutal clarity. He stopped at one page showing medical payments made directly to UPMC Mercy for Linda Holloway's cardiac treatment. Total transferred $46,218.11. Another showed commercial restructuring support for Holloway Fine Furniture. Another covered Tyler's private debt consolidation agreement. Preston closed the binder again. Outside, a police siren echoed through downtown traffic. What happens now? He asked. Evelyn stood and walked toward the window. Now we remind everyone that facts age better than emotions. She turned back toward him. Grant Carlyle is expecting a tired blue-collar husband, desperate to protect his dignity. Preston said nothing. Evelyn's eyes sharpened slightly. What he's about to meet, instead, is a man with records. The phrase settled heavily into the room. A man with records. Not accusations, not revenge fantasies. Proof. Quiet. Organized. Dangerous proof. Preston rose slowly from the chair. For the first time since Vanessa walked out, something inside him no longer felt wounded, not healed, but steadier, like a foundation finally touching concrete after years of standing in mud. Evelyn handed him a final envelope before he left. What's this courtesy copy? of what the first disclosure package going to Vanessa's attorney. Preston looked at the sealed envelope for several seconds. Inside it sat the truth, not spoken dramatically across a courtroom, not screamed during arguments, just documented, verified, real. He slid the envelope into his coat pocket beside the folded bank receipt, still resting there from 4 days earlier. Paid in full. Both phrases suddenly carried very different meanings now. As Preston stepped outside into the cold downtown rain, he realized something important. Vanessa still believed she had walked away from the weaker person in the marriage, and nobody had corrected her yet. The envelope arrived at the Holloway house on a Thursday morning, just after 9. Certified mail. Thick. Heavy enough to feel expensive before it was even opened. Douglas Holloway signed for it personally while still wearing a cashmere robe and house slippers. Snow covered the front lawn in uneven white patches, left behind from the previous night's storm. A black Range Rover sat warming in the circular driveway, while financial news played quietly from televisions mounted throughout the house. For a few minutes, Douglas ignored the envelope completely. He assumed it was divorce paperwork. Another unpleasant administrative detail connected to Vanessa leaving Preston. Nothing urgent, nothing dangerous. That changed the second he opened it in the kitchen. The first page carried the heading, Notice of Financial Interest and Documented Liability Structure. Douglas frowned immediately. By the third page, color began draining slowly from his face. Linda noticed from across the marble kitchen island. "What is it?" Douglas didn't answer. He kept turning pages faster now. Transfer schedules. Account references. Signed restructuring acknowledgments. Commercial lien notices. Every document carried Preston Woods' name. Not hidden, not partial, complete. Linda walked closer. Douglas. Finally, he looked up, and for the first time in years, genuine fear showed openly in his eyes. Call Vanessa. Upstairs, Vanessa was standing in the guest bathroom of Grant Carlisle's condo overlooking Market Square when her phone began vibrating repeatedly across the counter. She ignored the first call, then the second. By the fourth, irritation replaced avoidance. What she answered sharply. Douglas's voice came through strained and uneven. "Get to the house, now." Vanessa frowned. "I'm in the middle of now, Vanessa." The line disconnected. Grant emerged from the kitchen carrying coffee in dark ceramic mugs. What happened? Vanessa grabbed her coat. "I don't know." 25 minutes later, she walked into the Holloway kitchen and immediately sensed something was wrong. The atmosphere felt different. Too quiet. Douglas stood near the dining table holding documents in both hands. Linda sat motionless beside untouched coffee, while Tyler paced near the windows with his jaw clenched tight. Nobody looked angry. They looked exposed. Vanessa dropped her purse onto the counter. What happened? Douglas held up the paperwork slowly. This. She took the stack. At first, none of it made sense. Legal terminology, account references, payment structures. Then she saw the numbers. $46,218 medical settlement transfer. $82,400 commercial debt restructuring. $31,600 emergency tax liability coverage. Her eyes moved faster across the pages now. Every payment traced back to Preston. Not one-time help. Years of systematic financial support hidden behind legal agreements and restructuring terms. Vanessa stopped breathing normally. "What is this?" Tyler laughed once. "Not humor. Shock. That's apparently your husband, saving our asses for 3 straight years." Ex-husband, Vanessa almost corrected automatically. But the word caught in her throat. Douglas grabbed another page from the table. He paid the inventory lenders. Linda whispered softly, "No." He paid the medical collections, too. Vanessa looked down again. Preston Woods, repeated dozens of times across the paperwork. Transfer after transfer, month after month, quietly, systematically. Her stomach tightened painfully. "That can't be right." Tyler pointed toward the signatures. "It's right." Douglas's hands trembled slightly while flipping through additional pages. He structured all of it legally. Grant arrived 20 minutes later. Perfect coat, perfect posture, perfect confidence, entering a room that no longer supported it. "What exactly are we looking at?" he asked, calmly. Douglas shoved the paperwork toward him. Grant read quickly. Too quickly at first, then slower, much slower. The confidence around his mouth faded almost invisibly. That was the first thing Vanessa noticed. Grant finally looked up. "When did Preston disclose these agreements?" Douglas stared at him incredulously. "He didn't." Grant continued reading. The room remained silent, except for pages turning and wind brushing snow against the windows. Vanessa sat down slowly at the kitchen island. Fragments of the last 3 years began rearranging themselves in her head. The overnight shifts, the constant exhaustion, the old truck Preston never replaced, the cheap lunches, the way he never complained about money despite working constantly. Not because he lacked ambition, because he had been carrying hers. Linda pressed trembling fingers against her mouth. "Oh my God." Grant set several pages aside. "These are secured financial instruments," he said carefully. Tyler stopped pacing. In English, it means Preston documented everything. Douglas looked furious now. "You said divorce court would split assets evenly." Grant's expression hardened slightly. "I said that before learning your son-in-law quietly operated like a commercial lender." Former son-in-law Tyler muttered. Nobody corrected him. Vanessa kept staring at one particular page. UPMC, Mercy Cardiac Liability Settlement. Total paid $46,218.11. She remembered Preston sitting beside her mother's hospital bed at 2 a.m. while machines beeped softly around them. She remembered him saying they would figure it out. At the time, she thought it meant emotional support. Not this. Not years of sacrifice hidden behind silence. "Why wouldn't he tell me?" she asked quietly. Nobody answered. Because nobody in the room truly understood Preston. Not really. Douglas slammed one document onto the counter. "This says there are liens tied to the business property." Grant nodded once. "Conditional security interests." "Yes." "Can he take the showroom if repayment obligations fail under the agreement structure?" Grant paused carefully. Potentially, yes. Linda looked horrified, but he would never do that. Grant didn't answer immediately, because Grant understood something the Holloways were only beginning to realize. The quiet man they underestimated had protected himself better than any of them had. Tyler grabbed another document and swore under his breath. What Tyler looked toward Vanessa. He covered my debt consolidation too. Vanessa frowned. What debt consolidation? Tyler avoided eye contact instantly. That reaction alone answered enough. Douglas exploded next. You told us that issue was resolved. It was resolved. How Tyler threw the papers down. Apparently, Preston resolved it. The room fell silent again. Every hidden weakness now sat exposed beneath fluorescent kitchen lighting. Not because Preston attacked them, because paperwork did. Facts looked colder on paper than accusations ever sounded out loud. Grant finally removed his glasses and rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. That's not the worst part. Douglas stared at him. What do you mean, not the worst part? Grant tapped the divorce petition sitting nearby. Vanessa's filing portrays Preston as financially unstable and emotionally unavailable. Vanessa's chest tightened immediately. Grant continued calmly. These records create the opposite impression. Nobody spoke. Outside, a snowplow rumbled past the house. Grant reorganized the documents into cleaner stacks. He also has impeccable documentation. Dates, signatures, payment histories, everything. Douglas sank slowly into a chair. Linda looked close to tears. Vanessa still hadn't moved. She kept remembering small moments. Preston falling asleep at the kitchen table, grease stains on work jackets. His hands cracked from winter cold and industrial solvents. The way he always said he was fine. Grant finally looked directly at her. Did you genuinely not know about any of this? Vanessa answered honestly, no. And somehow, that single word made her feel worse than if she had known, because ignorance no longer felt innocent. It felt careless. Tyler suddenly laughed again, sharp, nervous. You left the guy the same week he finished paying everything off. Vanessa looked at him sharply. Shut up. But Tyler wasn't wrong. The timing sat there like broken glass in the middle of the kitchen. Grant gathered the documents carefully. I need time to review all of this before mediation. Douglas looked up. Mediation? Grant nodded. This divorce just became a financial disclosure case. That sentence changed the entire room. No more simple separation. No more easy narrative about a distant blue-collar husband who failed emotionally. Now there were records, structures, proof. And somewhere downtown, probably inside a maintenance corridor or elevator control room, Preston Woods was still quietly going to work while the truth detonated behind him. Vanessa suddenly stood. I need to talk to him. Grant's eyes lifted immediately. That's probably not wise right now. But Vanessa barely heard him. Because, for the first time in years, she realized she had no idea who her husband actually was. Mediation Room 4B sat on the third floor of the Allegheny County Family Court Building beneath rows of flickering fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly more exhausted than they already were. Preston arrived 12 minutes early. Of course he did. He wore the same dark charcoal coat he used for funerals, winter court hearings, and union meetings. Nothing expensive, nothing designed to impress. His boots were polished for the first time in months, though the leather still showed years of wear around the edges. In one hand, he carried a slim black binder. That was all. Evelyn Shaw walked beside him through the hallway carrying a leather portfolio thick enough to require both hands. Last chance to panic, she said calmly. Preston pressed the elevator button. I already used up my panic. The elevator doors opened with a soft, mechanical hum. Ironically, Preston noticed immediately the slight hesitation in the leveling sensor before the cab aligned with the floor. He mentally identified the likely issue out of habit. Even now, part of his brain remained at work. Evelyn watched him briefly. You're thinking about the elevator. It's off by a quarter inch. You're in divorce court and... I know, she almost smiled. Side mediation room 4B, Vanessa sat near the far side of the table, wearing a cream-colored coat over a black dress. Grant Carlyle sat beside her, reviewing paperwork with practiced focus. Douglas Holloway occupied a chair near the wall, looking pale and irritated. Tyler slouched beside him, tapping nervous fingers against his knee. The room shifted subtly the second Preston entered. Not dramatically, just enough, because everyone there knew something now they hadn't known before. Grant stood first. Mr. Woods. Preston shook his hand once. Grant's confidence remained intact, but something underneath it had changed. Men who spent their careers reading leverage recognized when hidden leverage suddenly appeared. Evelyn sat beside Preston and arranged her folders with surgical precision. The mediator entered moments later. Sandra Bellamy, mid-60s, sharp glasses, 30 years handling divorces complicated by money, ego, and dishonesty. She looked around the room once before sitting. Good morning. Nobody answered enthusiastically. Sandra opened the file. We are here regarding the dissolution proceedings between Preston Woods and Vanessa Woods, with additional financial disclosure concerns tied to associated debt structures. Even the wording sounded heavier now. Vanessa kept glancing toward Preston, not angrily, trying to read him, trying to locate the man she apparently never fully saw before. Preston remained calm, exhausted yet but steady. Sandra continued. Before we begin asset discussions, there are disclosure issues requiring clarification. Grant adjusted his cuff slightly. We acknowledge the newly presented financial documentation. Evelyn responded immediately. Newly presented to them. Not newly created. Grant's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Sandra raised one hand gently, one at a time. Then she looked toward Preston. Mr. Woods, did you intentionally conceal substantial financial support provided to the Holloway family during the marriage? The room went quiet. Preston answered honestly, I didn't advertise it. Sandra watched him over folded hands. Why? Because Vanessa already carried enough shame. Because Douglas would have rather died than publicly admit collapse. Because love sometimes looked like protecting people from realities they couldn't emotionally survive. But Preston simplified all of that into one sentence. They needed stability more than they needed speeches. Silence followed. Even Tyler stopped tapping his knee. Sandra nodded slowly and turned toward Evelyn. Proceed. Evelyn opened the first folder. What followed felt less like an argument and more like an audit. Transfer histories appeared one by one. Medical settlements, commercial restructuring agreements, tax liability coverage, inventory, lender negotiations. Every document cleanly time-stamped, every payment verified, every signature authenticated. Grant interrupted occasionally with technical questions, but even he sounded careful now. No theatrics, no aggressive objections. Because facts this organized became dangerous to fight emotionally. Vanessa stared at the documents as though each page rewrote another year of her marriage. At one point, Evelyn slid forward a payment summary from UPMC Mercy. Sandra adjusted her glasses. $46,000 in medical liabilities. Evelyn nodded. Directly settled by Mr. Woods across 18 months. Douglas lowered his eyes toward the floor. Vanessa looked physically ill. Grant cleared his throat quietly. Mrs. Woods was unaware of these transactions. Evelyn responded without hesitation. Unaware does not invalidate them. Sandra nodded once. Correct. Then came Holloway Fine Furniture, commercial loan restructuring, vendor settlements, deferred tax liabilities. Sandra looked increasingly unimpressed with the Holloway financial management structure. Tyler finally muttered, "This sounds way worse, Outload." Nobody disagreed. Preston said almost nothing throughout the session. That unsettled Vanessa more than anger would have. She kept waiting for bitterness, for accusation, for a speech about sacrifice. Instead, Preston simply sat there while paperwork spoke for him. Sandra eventually turned toward Vanessa directly. "Mrs. Woods, did you truly have no knowledge? Your husband was financially supporting your family at this level?" Vanessa swallowed hard. "No." Sandra studied her carefully. "None." Vanessa shook her head slowly. "I knew he worked a lot. I knew he helped sometimes. I didn't know." Her voice faltered slightly. "I didn't know it was everything. Everything." The word landed heavily inside the room. Because that was the truth. None of them wanted spoken plainly. Preston had not offered occasional support. He became structural support. Sandra wrote several notes before looking back toward the financial summaries. "Mr. Woods," she asked quietly, "why structure these as secured agreements instead of gifts?" Preston finally leaned forward slightly. "Because Evelyn told me people behave differently once pressure changes," Evelyn added calmly. "And because undocumented money disappears in courtrooms." Grant exhaled slowly through his nose. Sandra continued reviewing pages. Then she reached the final transfer record. The last payment. $41,903.27. Processed 4 hours before Vanessa left the marital residence. Sandra looked up. This timing is accurate. Evelyn nodded, verified by bank records. The room became perfectly still. Vanessa looked toward Preston immediately. For the first time all morning, emotion cracked visibly across her face. Not embarrassment anymore. Understanding. Allow. Painful. Understanding. She remembered that night now, through completely different eyes. The wet snow on his jacket. The exhaustion in his posture. The strange calm when she said she was leaving. Preston had walked through that apartment door, carrying proof he had just finished saving her entire family. And she left before even asking why he looked so tired. Tyler muttered under his breath, "Jesus Christ." Grant finally leaned toward Vanessa and whispered something quietly. She barely responded. Sandra closed the folder. "Well," she said softly, "this certainly changes the financial narrative." Grant straightened carefully. "We still maintain Mrs. Woods has legitimate marital claims." "Of course," Sandra replied. "But those claims now exist alongside substantial documented contributions from Mr. Woods." Evelyn slid another document forward. "There is also the issue of reimbursement structures tied to Holloway business assets." Douglas immediately stiffened. Grant read the page quickly, then slower. Again that tiny shift crossed his face. Concern. Real concern this time. Sandra noticed. "So there are enforceable security interests connected to the furniture business." Evelyn nodded. "Yes." Douglas suddenly spoke for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. "Preston wouldn't enforce those." The room turned toward him. Preston met Douglas's eyes calmly. "You signed them. Not cruel, not threatening, just true." Douglas looked away first. Sandra removed her glasses slowly. "I'm recommending we recess for today and continue after supplemental disclosures are completed." Nobody objected. The session was already collapsing under the weight of too many revelations. As everyone began gathering papers, Vanessa finally spoke directly to Preston, quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" The room slowed. Even Grant looked toward him. Preston considered the question for several seconds, then answered in the same calm tone he had used all morning. "Because I thought protecting your family mattered more than getting credit for it." Vanessa's eyes watered immediately. Preston stood before she could respond further. He picked up the slim black binder, still almost empty compared to Evelyn's stacks, because the real weight had never been in the folders. It had been in the years behind them. As Preston walked toward the door, Sandra Bellamy watched him carefully. Then she glanced toward Evelyn and murmured quietly enough that only nearby people heard it. "Your client is either remarkably disciplined." She looked toward the devastated silence surrounding the Holloway side of the room. "Or he spent years preparing for a betrayal he hoped would never happen." Preston paused briefly near the hallway outside, not because he disagreed, because deep down he wasn't completely sure which one was true anymore. Grant Carlisle stopped calling Vanessa as often after mediation. That was the first change. Small, subtle. But Preston noticed it immediately, through the rhythm of legal communication. Before Room 4B, emails from Grant arrived fast and aggressive. Demands came wrapped in polished corporate language about fairness, emotional neglect, and marital entitlement. Everything sounded confident, expensive. After Room 4B, the tone shifted. Requests became cautious. Deadlines softened. Questions multiplied. Evelyn Shaw noticed too. Who? He's recalculating, she said one evening while reviewing updated disclosures inside her downtown office. Rain hammered against the windows overlooking Grant Street. Preston sat across from her, wearing a dark thermal shirt beneath his work jacket, grease still visible around one cuff from an emergency repair at Allegheny General. Recalculating what risk? Evelyn slid another folder toward him. Vanessa's amended financial disclosure. Preston opened it slowly. New bank activity. Credit card summaries. Temporary housing expenses. Transfers between Vanessa and Grant. Nothing dramatic, individually, but together they created patterns. Evelyn tapped one page. She moved money after separation without reporting it initially. Preston looked down at the highlighted entries. Is that illegal? Not necessarily. Evelyn leaned back. But judges hate incomplete disclosures, especially after someone already claimed financial secrecy. That irony did not escape either of them. 3 years, Preston hid sacrifice to protect Vanessa's dignity. Now Vanessa stood vulnerable because she failed to disclose relatively minor financial movements during divorce proceedings. Truth had strange timing sometimes. Preston closed the folder. I don't want to destroy her. Evelyn's expression remained neutral. That's not what's happening. It could. No, she corrected calmly. What's happening is documentation. That word again. Documentation. Facts without performance. Evelyn organized several pages into cleaner stacks before continuing. There's another issue involving Grant. Preston stayed silent. His firm represents 2 development groups tied indirectly to financing discussions with Holloway Fine Furniture. That pulled Preston's attention fully back. And if he had bid Vanessa strategically, while personally involved with her opposing counsel, could argue compromised judgment. Preston frowned slightly. You're saying he crossed a line. I'm saying attorneys prefer distance between romance and financial litigation. Outside, thunder rolled across downtown Pittsburgh. Evelyn continued reading through emails printed neatly in chronological order. Then she stopped at one particular chain. Interesting. What? She handed him the page. The message came from Tyler Holloway. 6 months earlier. Need another extension. Preston can probably help again if Vanessa talks to him. Preston stared at the sentence quietly. Another email followed from Douglas. Don't mention numbers over text. Another from Tyler. He never asks questions anyway. Preston read that line twice. Not because it hurt, because it clarified things. The Holloways had slowly stopped viewing his sacrifices as sacrifices at all. Consistency became expectation. Silence became invisibility. Evelyn watched him carefully. "You okay?" "Yeah." But the answer carried less certainty now. Because there was something uniquely exhausting about seeing proof that people relied on your loyalty while privately dismissing your value. Evelyn tapped Tyler's message. This helps establish knowledge. Knowledge of what? That your financial support wasn't entirely invisible to the family. Preston leaned back slowly. He remembered every overtime shift behind those emails, every freezing morning drinking gas station coffee, while Tyler casually assumed more help would appear somehow. Not because Tyler respected Preston, because Preston always delivered. That was the dangerous thing about reliable people. Eventually, others stopped imagining limits. A week later, another mediation session convened in a smaller conference room downtown. Grant looked different this time, still polished, still controlled, but tired around the eyes. Pressure had finally reached him, too. Vanessa sat beside him in silence. While reviewing papers she barely seemed able to focus on anymore. She looked thinner than before, less certain inside expensive clothing that suddenly appeared almost costume-like under fluorescent light. Sandra Bellamy entered carrying supplemental disclosures. Let's continue. The next 2 hours turned technical quickly. Asset tracing, transfer timing, disclosure amendments, business obligations. Preston answered questions directly whenever asked. Short responses, precise, never emotional. Sandra appreciated that. Grant less so. At one point, Evelyn introduced a series of email records establishing that Tyler and Douglas both understood external financial support existed long before litigation began. Grant objected immediately. These messages are speculative. Evelyn remained perfectly calm. They establish awareness inconsistent with prior representations. Sandra nodded once. Agreed. Grant's jaw tightened. Vanessa stared at the emails like someone reading evidence from another lifetime. Tyler shifted uncomfortably beside the wall. Sandra turned toward him. "Mr. Holloway, did you understand your brother-in-law was assisting financially?" Tyler rubbed one hand across his face. "I knew he helped sometimes." How often Tyler hesitated. Too long. Sandra noticed. Evelyn noticed. Everyone noticed. Finally, Tyler muttered, "More than I admitted before." Sandra wrote notes silently. Grant interrupted carefully. "We should avoid turning this proceeding into an extended examination of family misunderstandings." Evelyn answered instantly. "Family misunderstandings don't generate $300,000 in documented transfers." Silence followed. Grant looked irritated for the first time openly. Not angry. Cornered. There was a difference. Preston watched quietly. Men like Grant thrive in situations where confidence shaped reality. Courtrooms usually rewarded presentation almost as much as facts. But this situation refused simplification. Because Preston's records were too clean, too disciplined. No hidden accounts, no emotional spending, No revenge purchases after separation. Just years of work translated into number nobody could argue with. Sandra eventually addressed Vanessa directly again. Mrs. Woods, have you reviewed the complete financial timeline? Vanessa nodded slowly. Yes. Do you dispute the payments? No. Sandra removed her glasses briefly. Then we are no longer debating whether Mr. Woods contributed substantially to your family's financial survival. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Grant spoke carefully beside her. We acknowledge Mr. Woods made extraordinary contributions. Extraordinary. Interesting word choice. Not generous, not loving. Extraordinary sounded clinical enough to survive professionally. Preston noticed the wording immediately. Of course he did. Sandra continued reviewing updated property considerations. The Brookline house remained protected through the trust structure. The Holloway business liabilities remained enforceable through signed agreements. Vanessa's original assumptions about marital leverage weakened page by page. Then Evelyn introduced one final issue. Your Honor, she said calmly, though technically Sandra was not a judge. We also identified discrepancies regarding post-separation financial transfers tied to Mr. Carlyle. Grant straightened immediately. What discrepancies? Evelyn slid forward, printed bank summaries. Vanessa looked confused. Grant looked irritated now. Sandra reviewed the pages carefully. These payments originated from your personal accounts, Mr. Carlyle. They were temporary living accommodations. Undisclosed during preliminary review. Grant exhaled slowly. Because they were informal. Sandra looked unimpressed. Informal financial relationships tend to become very formal inside divorce proceedings. Tyler actually snorted quietly at that. Douglas silenced him with a glare. Vanessa finally spoke. Grant? He didn't look at her immediately. That small hesitation mattered more than words. Preston saw it. Vanessa saw it too. So, for the first time, Grant Carlyle no longer looked entirely in control of the room. And men like Grant built entire identities around control. After another hour, Sandra recessed the session. People gathered papers quietly. No one spoke much. The energy had shifted too far from confidence into exposure. As Preston prepared to leave, Grant approached him near the hallway outside. No hard feelings, Grant said carefully. Preston studied him for a moment. There it was. The retreat. Subtle. Professional. Grant already sensed where this story ended. Preston answered honestly. I never hated you. Grant seemed surprised by that. Then what? Preston glanced briefly toward the conference room, where Vanessa sat alone staring at paperwork. You just arrived. After the hard part was over. Grant said nothing, because there was no defense against that sentence. Not a legal one, anyway. As Preston walked toward the elevator lobby, Evelyn fell into step beside him. Well, she murmured quietly, the expensive shoes are finally slipping. Preston pressed the elevator button. For the first time in months, something inside him felt strangely lighter. Not victorious, just clearer. Because the truth no longer belonged only to him, anymore. Now everyone had to carry their piece of it too. Tyler Holloway arrived 22 minutes late to the financial disclosure hearing wearing a navy quarter-zip sweater that looked expensive until someone noticed the loose stitching near the collar. Preston noticed immediately. He noticed everything now. The hearing took place in a smaller review chamber inside Allegheny County Family Court, quieter than mediation, and far less forgiving. No polished introductions, no carefully staged charm, just fluorescent lights, legal pads, and financial records stacked across long conference tables. Tyler walked in carrying nervous energy, like static electricity. Douglas looked furious already. Vanessa looked exhausted. Grant Carlyle looked increasingly detached from all of it. And Preston sat beside Evelyn Shaw with the same calm posture he carried into elevator shafts during mechanical failures. Steady hands, controlled breathing, minimal words. Tyler dropped into his chair and muttered, "Sorry, traffic." Nobody acknowledged it. Sandra Bellamy adjusted her glasses and opened the next disclosure file. "Mr. Tyler Holloway," she said evenly, "we're here to clarify outstanding inconsistencies connected to prior debt consolidation statements." Tyler swallowed. "Okay." Evelyn slid several pages forward. Mr. Holloway previously represented that certain liabilities tied to Holloway Freight Solutions had been resolved independently. Tyler shifted in his seat. They were. Evelyn's voice stayed perfectly calm. No. They were transferred. She placed another document on the table, a signed restructuring agreement. Tyler's signature sat clearly at the bottom. Preston remembered that night instantly. Tyler had shown up at the apartment after midnight 3 years earlier, wearing panic beneath forced confidence. He claimed lenders were threatening litigation. Payroll obligations had collapsed. One of his former business partners disappeared to Arizona after draining operating accounts. Tyler cried that night. Not dramatically, quietly, mostly from humiliation. Preston remembered sitting across from him at the kitchen table while Vanessa slept down the hallway, unaware. "You can't tell my dad," Tyler whispered back then. "He'll lose his mind." Preston had agreed. Another mistake made through loyalty. Sandra reviewed the agreement silently. "This indicates Mr. Woods assumed structured responsibility for approximately $82,000 connected to your business failure." Tyler rubbed a hand across his jaw. "Yeah. Did you repay any substantial portion?" Tyler hesitated. "Too long again?" "No." The room stayed silent. Not hostile, just honest. Now. That honesty carried its own weight. Douglas stared at his son with open disappointment. Vanessa looked stunned all over again, not because Tyler failed, because Preston had protected Tyler too. Another secret burden she never noticed. Sandra continued. "There are also indications portions of the transferred funds were not used strictly for business stabilization." Tyler immediately looked defensive. "What's that supposed to mean?" Evelyn opened another folder. "Credit card records, casino withdrawals, luxury retail purchases, vehicle lease payments." Tyler's face changed instantly. "There it is," Evelyn said quietly. "The real problem." Douglas leaned forward sharply. You told me the business burned through everything. It did. Sandra pointed toward the records. Not all of it, apparently. Tyler's breathing grew uneven now. These were temporary expenses. $7,000 at Rivers Casino? Evelyn asked calmly. Tyler looked cornered. It wasn't like that. Preston remained silent, but memories surfaced one after another. Tyler arriving in expensive jackets while claiming total financial ruin. Tyler talking about recovery plans while Preston quietly rerouted overtime income toward lender negotiations. Tyler calling him reliable. That word felt uglier now. Reliable often meant exploitable to people unwilling to carry their own weight. Vanessa finally spoke. You used the money for gambling. Tyler looked toward her desperately. It wasn't gambling like you think. Grant Carlyle leaned back in his chair slowly. That movement alone told Preston everything. Grant was distancing himself mentally already. No attorney liked messy financial behavior once courts started reviewing timelines. Evelyn slid another item forward, a voicemail transcript. Tyler's face drained immediately. Sandra looked up. What's this? Audio evidence provided voluntarily by Mr. Woods, Evelyn answered. Preston hadn't listened to the recording in over a year. He remembered exactly when it was left. 9:13 a.m. Rainstorm outside. Emergency elevator repair at St. Clair Hospital. His phone vibrating inside the maintenance corridor. Tyler had been drunk, scared too. Sandra began reading silently, then aloud. Preston, hey, I know you hate attention, man, but thank you. Seriously. You saved me. Don't tell Vanessa I called. I know what you're doing for all of us. Silence swallowed the room afterward. Tyler closed his eyes briefly. Vanessa stared at him. You knew. It was complicated. No, she said quietly. You knew. Tyler looked toward Preston now. Not arrogantly anymore. Ashamed. Look, I didn't know how to fix any of it. Preston finally spoke for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. So you let someone else fix it? For you? Tyler flinched slightly. Not because Preston raised his voice. Because he didn't. Calm disappointment always cut deeper than anger. Sandra folded her hands together. This changes the disclosure landscape significantly. Grant nodded reluctantly. Yes. That single word sounded expensive, coming from him, measured, controlled, but exhausted. Douglas suddenly stood and walked toward the windows overlooking the courthouse parking lot. Snow drifted lightly outside, while traffic moved slowly beneath gray skies. My entire family has been living inside a lie, he muttered. Preston understood why he said it. But the statement wasn't fully accurate. The lie wasn't the debt. The lie was assuming quiet people carried less weight simply because they complained less about it. Vanessa looked toward Preston again. There was no defensiveness left in her expression now, only reconstruction. Like someone mentally rebuilding years she previously misunderstood. You paid Tyler's debt too, she asked softly. Preston nodded once. Why? Because he loved her. Because families collapse collectively even when only one member fails. Because some people solve problems quietly instead of publicly. But he simplified it again. Your mother was already sick. Your father was already drowning. Vanessa lowered her eyes immediately. Grant checked his watch. Small gesture, important gesture. Preston noticed it. Grant wanted out, not officially yet, but emotionally. The situation no longer resembled a glamorous escape story involving a neglected woman and a successful attorney. Now it looked like exactly what it was. A financially disciplined man quietly holding together people who underestimated him. Sandra eventually requested additional supplemental disclosures tied to Tyler's prior representations. Tyler looked miserable now. Douglas looked old. Linda looked heartbroken. Vanessa looked like someone waking up too late. And Preston simply looked tired, not triumphant. That mattered, because he never wanted revenge. He wanted truth placed where nobody could avoid it anymore. As papers shuffled toward the end of the session, Tyler suddenly spoke again. Quiet this time. I never thanked you properly. Nobody moved. Preston looked at him calmly. You did once. Tyler frowned slightly. The voicemail, Preston nodded. That was enough. Tyler stared at the table afterward, unable to respond. Because both men understood something uncomfortable in that moment. Preston had never demanded worship, never demanded repayment, never even demanded acknowledgement. He only expected people not to mistake silence for weakness. Sandra closed the file slowly. We'll reconvene after updated financial certifications are submitted. Everyone stood gradually. Chairs scraped against tile flooring. Grant gathered papers without speaking much. Vanessa remained seated several seconds longer than everyone else. Then finally, she looked up at Preston. I don't know how to talk to you anymore. That sentence carried more honesty than anything she'd said in weeks. Preston considered it quietly, then answered with the same steady voice that carried him through every disaster so far. You never really did. Vanessa's eyes watered instantly. Not from cruelty, from recognition. Because deep down, she knew he was right. She spent years speaking around Preston instead of into him, talking about appearances instead of fears, ambition instead of sacrifice, image instead of foundation. Now the foundation sat exposed in court records and bank transfers, while everything built on top of it cracked apart under pressure. As Preston walked toward the hallway, Evelyn stepped beside him. You handled that well. I'm not trying to humiliate them. I know. She glanced back toward the room, where Tyler still sat, motionless at the table. That's probably why this hurts them so much. Preston said nothing. Because Evelyn was right. Cruelty could be dismissed, but truth delivered calmly. Truth stayed. And somewhere behind them, inside a courthouse filled with dissolving marriages and broken promises, the Holloway family finally began understanding the cost of the quiet man they spent years overlooking. Vanessa found Preston at 2:18 in the morning inside the employee parking garage beneath UPMC Presbyterian. Rainwater dripped steadily from exposed concrete beams overhead. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly against oil-stained floors, while distant ambulance sirens echoed through the sleeping city above. Preston had just finished replacing a damaged elevator door motor on the trauma wing's service lift. His shoulders ached. Grease stained both sleeves of his dark thermal shirt. One knuckle had split open against a steel panel earlier during the repair. He barely noticed anymore. He walked through the parking garage, carrying a metal toolbox in one hand and a paper cup of burnt vending machine coffee in the other, when he saw Vanessa standing beside his truck. She looked completely out of place there. Camel coat, black boots, hair damp from rain, no polished rooftop bars, no luxury dinners, no downtown lighting soft enough to hide uncertainty, just concrete and fluorescent exhaustion. Preston stopped walking. Vanessa stepped toward him slowly. "I called you. I was working. You didn't answer." Preston set the toolbox into the truck bed before speaking. "What do you need?" That question hurt her immediately. Not because it sounded cruel, because it sounded distant. Vanessa wrapped her arms tightly against herself. "I needed to see you." Preston leaned lightly against the truck. Rain tapped steadily across the garage entrance behind them. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Vanessa looked around the parking structure. "You really spend your nights in places like this?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Preston glanced toward the elevators behind him. "Usually worse." That answer landed heavily, because she suddenly realized she never truly pictured his life while he worked overnight. She imagined work, not machine rooms, not freezing maintenance corridors, not emergency calls at 2 a.m, while entire hospitals depended on systems functioning properly. Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly. "You look exhausted." Preston almost smiled at the irony. Now she noticed, after everything collapsed. "You didn't come here to discuss my sleep schedule." She nodded slowly. "No." Rainwater rolled through the garage floor drains nearby while ambulance lights flashed faintly across concrete walls from the emergency entrance above. Vanessa inhaled carefully. Why didn't you tell me Preston already knew what she meant? Not the debt itself, the whole thing, the sacrifices, the hidden structure underneath their entire marriage. He stared past her toward the rain outside. Would it have changed anything? Vanessa answered, too slowly. And that silence became the answer. Preston nodded once. "That's what I thought." She stepped closer. "That's not fair." "No," he agreed quietly. "It isn't." Vanessa looked wounded by the calmness in his voice. Not cold, just finished. That frightened her more than anger would have. "I would have helped you," she said. Preston finally looked directly at her. "How?" The word hit harder than she expected, because she had no immediate answer. Preston continued calmly. "You didn't know how much debt existed. You didn't know about your father's lenders. You didn't know Tyler was still hiding liabilities. You didn't even know your mother's treatment balances." Vanessa swallowed hard. "You should have trusted me." "I did trust you." "Then why keep it secret?" Preston looked down briefly at his hands. The skin around his knuckles remained cracked from years of winter repairs and industrial solvents. Finally, he answered, "Because I knew how ashamed you already felt." Vanessa stared at him silently. Preston's voice stayed low and steady. "You were already carrying your family's collapse around every day. I wasn't going to hand you spreadsheets, too." That broke something quietly inside her expression. Rain continued falling beyond the garage entrance, while a maintenance cart rattled faintly somewhere deeper underground. Vanessa wiped quickly beneath one eye. "You paid $300,000 for people who barely appreciated you." Preston shrugged slightly. "They were your family. That's not an answer?" "It's the only one I have." Vanessa shook her head slowly. "No, there has to be more than that." Maybe there was. Love, duty, habit. The strange instincts some men carried to absorb damage silently if it kept everyone else standing. But Preston had never been good at translating those things into speeches. He solved problems physically instead, one repair at a time. Vanessa looked at the truck behind him. The same old Ford, same cracked dashboard, same faded work stickers near the rear window. "You could have changed your whole life with that money." Preston answered immediately. "I was trying to—" That sentence emptied the air between them, because she finally understood what he meant. The money was never about debt. It was about building stability, a future, a marriage strong enough to survive pressure. And while Preston spent years constructing it quietly, Vanessa spent those same years searching for signs of ambition, loud enough to impress her. She covered her mouth briefly. "Oh my God." Preston remained still. No accusation, no bitterness, just truth standing there in fluorescent light. Vanessa looked at him differently now. Not because he secretly had money. That misunderstanding disappeared already. What changed was scale. She finally saw the size of the burden he carried without asking anyone to clap for it. "You sold things, didn't you?" she asked softly. Preston hesitated, then nodded once. "My startup shares." Her eyes widened immediately. "You told me you were holding those long term." "I was. Those could have been worth millions someday." "Maybe." Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. "You gave that up for us," Preston leaned against the truck again. "For stability." The answer somehow hurt worse, because he never framed sacrifice dramatically. That made it impossible to dismiss as manipulation. Vanessa stepped closer again. "I made you feel small." Preston stayed quiet. She laughed once softly, through tears. "That silence means yes. It means you already know." Rain hammered harder now outside the garage, while cold wind drifted through the lower level entrance. Vanessa looked exhausted suddenly, not physically, emotionally stripped down. All this time, she whispered, "I thought you didn't want more out of life." Preston looked toward the elevators again. "I wanted peace." The simplicity of that answer nearly destroyed her. Because Grant wanted status. Douglas wanted image. Tyler wanted escape. Vanessa wanted upward movement. Only Preston ever wanted peace. And somehow, he became the one everyone overlooked. Vanessa's voice cracked slightly. I left you the same day you finished fixing everything. Preston didn't respond because there was nothing useful to add to that truth. She shook her head slowly. I can't stop thinking about that night. Neither could he. The suitcase, the snow, the folded bank receipt inside his pocket while she walked away with another man. Vanessa wiped her eyes again. Why didn't you stop me? That question finally drew a visible reaction from Preston. Not anger. Sadness. Small, but real. He looked at her carefully before answering. Because I didn't want someone staying out of guilt. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. Another ambulance siren echoed somewhere above them. When she opened her eyes again, she looked terrified for the first time since entering the garage. Not of Preston, of consequences, of realization, of understanding someone fully only after losing access to them. I don't know what to do now, she admitted quietly. Preston nodded once. Honesty at last. Then he opened the truck door. Vanessa looked up quickly. That's it. What else is there? I said I was sorry. I know. And Preston rested one hand on the truck door. Rain reflected silver across the garage floor between them. Finally, he spoke. I spent years trying to leave you with your dignity. Vanessa froze completely. Because suddenly everything made sense. Why he hid the debt. Why he never exposed Tyler. Why he protected Douglas from humiliation. Why he absorbed pressure quietly instead of announcing sacrifice publicly. Even now, after betrayal, he still spoke like someone protecting her, not punishing her. That realization hurt more than rage ever could have. Preston climbed into the truck. Vanessa stood motionless beside the parking space. The engine started with its familiar rough vibration. Before pulling away, Preston lowered the window slightly. You should go home, Vanessa. Home. The word sounded uncertain now. Then the truck rolled slowly through the parking garage and disappeared into the rain-soaked Pittsburgh night, leaving Vanessa alone beneath fluorescent lights with the full weight of what she had walked away from finally settling onto her shoulders. The final financial hearing took place on a gray Thursday morning beneath heavy clouds, hanging low over downtown Pittsburgh. Rain streaked across courthouse windows while people hurried through security, carrying briefcases, coffee cups, and exhausted expressions. The Allegheny County Family Court building smelled faintly of wet coats and industrial floor cleaner. Preston arrived early again, not out of anxiety, habit. Years of emergency maintenance work trained him to appear before problems did. He sat quietly beside Evelyn Shaw in courtroom 2C while reviewing the final settlement summaries one last time. The black binder rested neatly on the table between them, thinner now after months of disclosures, mediation, and financial tracing. Most of the fighting had already died. Truth usually exhausted conflict eventually. Vanessa entered several minutes later wearing a dark navy coat and almost no makeup. The change looked subtle to anyone else, not to Preston. She no longer dressed like someone trying to win a room. Grant Carlyle walked beside her carrying a slim portfolio, though even his posture seemed different now. Less polished, less certain, like a man already halfway emotionally removed from a case he no longer believed in. Douglas and Linda Holloway sat quietly in the back row. Tyler arrived last. Nobody spoke much before proceedings began. Judge Miriam Holloway entered at precisely 9 o'clock. Mid-60s. Sharp voice. Little patience for emotional performances unsupported by evidence. She reviewed the file silently for nearly 3 minutes before speaking. I've gone through the supplemental disclosures, mediation summaries, and financial records submitted by both parties. The courtroom remained still. Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses slightly. This case began as a fairly standard dissolution proceeding. A pause. It is no longer standard. No one disagreed. The judge turned first toward Vanessa. Mrs. Woods originally alleged financial instability and emotional absence on the part of Mr. Woods. Vanessa lowered her eyes slightly. Judge Holloway continued. The documentation presented demonstrates substantial, long-term financial support provided by Mr. Woods, not only toward marital obligations, but toward extended family liabilities. Grant shifted subtly beside Vanessa. Judge Holloway noticed immediately. These records are exceptionally thorough. That sentence mattered because judges trusted consistency more than charm. And Preston's entire life was built on consistency. Evelyn remained calm beside him while the judge reviewed property considerations. The Brookline residence remains protected under premarital trust structures. Claims against the property are therefore limited. Vanessa nodded once quietly. No argument. That fight ended weeks earlier. The judge moved next toward the Holloway business obligations. Signed restructuring agreements tied to Holloway fine furniture appear legally enforceable. Douglas looked physically older, hearing the words aloud. Judge Holloway turned a page. However, everyone lifted slightly at that. Mr. Woods has not sought aggressive enforcement despite holding clear leverage. For the first time that morning, the judge looked directly at Preston. That restraint is noted by the court. Preston answered simply, I didn't want to destroy anyone. The judge studied him carefully. That answer sounded different after months of evidence. Not dramatic, credible. Grant finally spoke. My client acknowledges Mr. Woods acted generously. Interesting shift from financially secretive. Judge Holloway's expression barely changed. Generosity is not the central issue here, Mr. Carlyle. Transparency and equity are. Grant nodded once. Carefully, the hearing continued for nearly another hour. Asset distribution, account separation, tax responsibilities, reimbursement structures, everything reduced to paper signatures and legal language. That was the strange thing about divorce. Years of marriage eventually collapsed into numbered paragraphs. At one point, Judge Holloway addressed Vanessa again directly. "Mrs. Woods, do you dispute any of the documented contributions made by your husband?" Vanessa looked toward Preston before answering. "No," the judge nodded. "Do you dispute that those contributions materially preserved your family's financial position?" Another pause. Then no. The honesty sounded painful. Because it was. Judge Holloway folded her hands together. In light of the evidence presented, the court finds Mr. Woods acted with unusual financial discipline and substantial good faith throughout the marriage. Preston remained still. But inside something shifted quietly. Not pride. Relief, baby. Because, for the first time, someone in authority looked directly at the truth instead of appearances surrounding it. Judge Holloway finalized the primary settlement terms shortly afterward. Vanessa would receive limited transitional support, no claim against the trust property, shared marital accounts divided proportionally. The Holloway business obligations would remain enforceable under negotiated repayment structures supervised outside family court. Far less devastating than what Preston legally could have pursued. That mattered too. The judge noticed. "Mr. Woods," she said, reviewing the final summary, "you had grounds to press significantly harder regarding several financial recoveries." Preston answered honestly, "I know. Why didn't you—" The courtroom went quiet again. Preston thought briefly about the parking garage conversation with Vanessa, about Linda's hospital room years earlier, about Tyler crying quietly at the kitchen table after midnight. Then he answered with the same calm voice he used for everything important. Because punishment and closure aren't the same thing. Even the court reporter paused briefly before continuing to type. Judge Holloway watched him carefully, then nodded once. Fair enough. The hearing concluded 23 minutes later. Just like that. Years finished. The marriage legally dissolved beneath fluorescent courtroom lighting, and rain tapping softly against tall windows. People began gathering papers quietly. No celebration, no dramatic collapse, just exhaustion settling across everyone differently. Douglas approached Preston first near the courtroom exit. The older man looked uncomfortable in a way Preston had never seen before. Not arrogant, not defensive. Human. "I misjudged you," Douglas admitted quietly. Preston said nothing. Douglas swallowed once. "You carried all of us." "No," Preston replied calmly. "I carried debt. There's a difference." Douglas lowered his eyes because he understood exactly what Preston meant. Money could stabilize people temporarily. Character was something else entirely. Tyler approached next. He looked embarrassed just standing there. "I'm getting help," he said quietly. Preston nodded once. "Good. I mean it this time." I know. Tyler frowned slightly. How Preston almost smiled. Because this is the first time you sound ashamed instead of unlucky. That sentence stayed with Tyler visibly. Then came Vanessa. Everyone else drifted away slowly, until only the two of them remained near the courtroom hallway windows, overlooking rain-covered streets below. For several seconds, neither spoke. Vanessa looked exhausted, not from court, from realization. I kept waiting for you to hate me, she admitted softly. Preston looked out toward downtown Pittsburgh. I tried. Her eyes widened slightly. But you couldn't. Preston thought about that honestly. Hatred required energy, and most of his energy had already been spent surviving. Finally, he answered, I just got tired. Vanessa's eyes filled immediately. That hurt more than anger. Because tiredness meant something had truly ended. Not exploded, ended. Quietly. Like a machine finally shutting down after running too long. She wiped beneath one eye quickly. I'm sorry, Preston. This time, the apology sounded real. No defense attached to it. No excuses, just grief. Preston nodded slowly. I know. And for the first time, he truly did. Vanessa looked like she wanted to say more. Maybe ask for another chance. Maybe ask whether anything could still be repaired. But some questions arrived too late to survive honest answers. So instead she whispered, You deserve better from me. Preston looked at her one final time, then answered with complete calm, Maybe. But I deserved better from myself too. Vanessa frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means I should have stopped carrying people who were comfortable watching me break. Silence followed. Heavy silence. True silence. Then Preston picked up the black binder from the bench beside him. Years of sacrifice reduced to organized paperwork and closing signatures. Finished. As he walked down the courthouse hallway toward the elevators, rainlight reflected softly across polished floors beneath his boots. And for the first time, in a very long time, Preston Woods no longer felt responsible for saving everyone around him. The apartment sounded different after the divorce finalized. Quieter, not emotionally quieter, structurally quieter. No hairdryer running before work. No television playing reality show in the background. No phone calls drifting through the kitchen, while Vanessa cooked expensive recipes she barely touched afterward. Just radiator pipes knocking softly at night, and the occasional rumble of traffic outside Pioneer Avenue. Preston noticed the silence most during mornings. For years, his life moved around another person's routines, without him realizing how much space that created inside a home. Now every object stayed exactly where he left it. No shoes near the couch. No half-finished coffee cups on the bathroom counter. No perfume drifting through the hallway after showers. At first, the stillness felt unnatural. Then slowly, it began feeling peaceful. 2 days after court, Preston started packing Vanessa's remaining belongings. Not violently, not emotionally. Carefully, that mattered. He folded sweaters instead of shoving them into boxes. Wrapped picture frames in old towels to keep the glass from cracking. Organized books by size, because Vanessa always liked symmetry on shelves. The process took nearly 6 hours. Rain tapped steadily against the apartment windows, while old jazz played softly from Preston's phone speaker near the sink. At one point, he found a small receipt tucked inside a coat pocket. Vanessa left hanging in the closet. Rooftop restaurant downtown. 2 cocktails, 1 filet mignon, Grant Carlisle. The date matched roughly 3 months before she moved out. Preston stared at the receipt for several seconds, then folded it once and dropped it into the trash. No anger, no ceremony, just finished. By evening, 12 labeled boxes sat stacked neatly near the front door. Vanessa texted shortly afterward, "Can I come tomorrow for the rest?" Preston looked at the message while sitting alone at the kitchen table, eating microwaved soup from a ceramic mug. Finally, he typed, "Yes, afternoon is fine. Nothing else, no bitterness, no invitation either." The next morning began at 4:40 a.m. with an emergency call from UPMC Presbyterian. Freight elevator malfunction. 3rd basement level. Preston drove downtown through freezing fog, while Pittsburgh still slept beneath pale winter darkness. By 7:30, he stood waist-deep inside an open control cabinet, tightening damaged relay connections, while hospital staff moved around him carrying coffee and patient charts. "You ever sleep?" one nurse asked jokingly. "Sometimes." She laughed. Preston didn't. Because exhaustion had stopped feeling temporary a long time ago. Around noon, his supervisor called, unexpectedly. "Need you upstairs. Why, administration meeting." Preston frowned slightly. Maintenance workers rarely got invited upstairs unless something had gone wrong. But when he entered the administrative conference room on the 12th floor, he found 3 people waiting instead. Hospital operations director, facilities manager, regional infrastructure consultant, all dressed like people whose hands never smelled like machine oil. The operations director stood first. "Mr. Woods, we've been reviewing your overnight performance reports." Preston remained cautious immediately. "Okay." The consultant slid several printed sheets across the table. Maintenance efficiency numbers, emergency response times, repair cost reductions, energy optimization recommendations Preston submitted months earlier and forgot about afterward. "We didn't realize you were doing this level of systems analysis," the consultant said. Preston shrugged slightly. "Machines tell you what they need if you pay attention long enough." The facilities manager smiled at that. Then came the offer. Regional elevator system supervisor. Higher salary. Day shifts, mostly. Company vehicle. Infrastructure oversight instead of constant emergency repairs. Preston sat quietly for several seconds after hearing the numbers. Not because he doubted himself, because the timing felt strange. For years he pushed himself beyond exhaustion simply to keep other people financially alive. Now suddenly there was room ahead of him again. The operations director misread his silence. "You don't have to answer immediately." "I'll take it," Preston said. 3 people smiled almost at once. As Preston signed preliminary paperwork, a strange realization settled quietly inside him. No one in that room cared about appearances, only results. That felt refreshing. By late afternoon, he returned to the apartment just before Vanessa arrived. She knocked softly. Preston opened the door wearing jeans and a gray, thermal shirt hands still marked with grease stains from work. Vanessa looked thinner again. The confidence she carried around Grant had mostly disappeared now, replaced by something more honest. Fatigue, maybe, or humility. Her eyes moved immediately toward the packed boxes near the wall. You already organized everything. Preston stepped aside slightly. Yeah. Vanessa entered quietly. For several minutes, she just looked around the apartment. The old radiator. The tilted kitchen floor. The dining table, where so many bills once sat hidden beneath silence. I used to hate this place, she admitted softly. Preston nodded. I know. And now it feels... She searched briefly for the word. Safe. That almost made him smile. Because safety was exactly what he spent years trying to build. Vanessa walked toward the stacked boxes. You wrapped the dishes so they wouldn't break. Another silence settled between them. Not hostile anymore, just sad. Vanessa glanced toward the kitchen table where a folder sat beside Preston's coffee mug. What's that work paperwork? She looked at him carefully. You got promoted, Preston shrugged lightly. Something like that. What kind of position? Regional systems supervisor? Real surprise crossed out her face immediately. That's huge. Yeah. You never told me you wanted management. Preston looked toward the window. I never really had room to think about what I wanted. The sentence landed hard again. Because it was true. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Grant moved out last week. Preston said nothing. He said things got too complicated. Still nothing. Vanessa laughed once quietly, without humor. I think he realized you weren't the man he assumed you were. Preston leaned lightly against the kitchen counter. That makes two of you. She nodded slowly. Fair enough. Vanessa eventually carried the first box toward the door. Preston helped load several into her SUV downstairs without either of them speaking much. Snow drifted lightly across the parking lot, while evening traffic moved slowly through Brookline. After the last box, Vanessa stood beside the open trunk, with both hands tucked into her coat pockets. I wrote you something, she said quietly. Preston frowned slightly. What? A letter. She reached into her purse and handed him a sealed envelope. I'm not asking for anything, she added quickly. I just needed to say things properly. Preston looked down at the envelope, then nodded once. Okay. Vanessa closed the trunk slowly afterward. For a second, it looked like she wanted to hug him. She didn't. Some distances could not be crossed physically anymore. I hope you find peace, Preston. The strange thing was, for the first time in years, he actually believed he might. Vanessa climbed into the SUV and drove away through light snowfall, while Preston stood alone beside the curb. Not abandoned this time. Released. Later that night, after another quiet dinner and a long shower, Preston finally opened the envelope Vanessa left behind. He read the first line, then stopped. Not because it hurt. Because exhaustion suddenly washed over him harder than any emotion had. 3 years of pressure, leaving the body, all at once. Preston folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the same lockbox holding the final bank receipt and all the old financial agreements. Then he closed the lid, locked it. And for the first time since this entire story began, he didn't feel the need to open it again. 6 months after the divorce, Preston Woods stopped waking up, expecting disaster. That was how he knew healing had finally started. Not because he felt happy every day, not because the past disappeared, but because silence no longer sounded like incoming collapse. Spring arrived slowly across Pittsburgh that year. Dirty snowbanks melted into rainwater streams along curbs. Construction crews returned downtown. The rivers reflected pale, morning sunlight instead of winter steel. And for the first time in years, Preston worked mostly during daylight. The new position changed everything quietly. Regional systems supervisor sounded corporate on paper, but most days still involved elevators, diagnostics, infrastructure reports, and emergency planning across multiple hospital campuses. The difference was pace. No more sleeping inside maintenance rooms between overnight calls. No more 14-hour emergency shifts, followed immediately by lender negotiations and hidden transfers. Now Preston carried a company vehicle, managed rotating crews, and spent mornings reviewing performance systems instead of crawling through elevator shafts at 3 in the morning. People listened when he spoke. That part still felt strange. One Tuesday morning, Preston stood inside the observation level cafeteria of UPMC Presbyterian, holding the same old plastic lunch container he'd used for years. Turkey sandwich, apple slices, black coffee. Some habits survived everything. Below the tall glass windows, Pittsburgh stretched across the hills in layers of bridges, steel, and moving traffic beneath pale blue skies. A younger technician named Marcus sat across from him halfway through lunch. "You know people are scared of you now, right?" Preston frowned slightly. What? Marcus laughed. "Not scared, scared. Respect, scared." Preston shook his head once. "I fix elevators." "No," Marcus replied. "You fix disasters before they happen." That's different. Interesting. Because that was exactly what he spent years doing inside his marriage, too. Only now, someone finally recognized it. Across town, the Holloway family had changed as well. Douglas sold part of the showroom property under restructuring agreements negotiated through Evelyn Shaw's office. Not catastrophic, but humbling. Tyler entered a gambling addiction recovery program voluntarily after nearly losing another business opportunity. For the first time in his adult life, he stopped talking like success was about to arrive magically next month. Linda continued cardiac treatment quietly and began volunteering twice a week at a church food pantry near Sewickley. People changed after exposure, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully. Vanessa changed most of all. Preston learned pieces indirectly through paperwork updates and occasional conversations with Evelyn. Grant Carlisle had fully withdrawn from her life shortly after the final hearings concluded. No dramatic betrayal, no screaming breakup, just distance. Grant preferred controlled environments, and nothing about the situation remained controllable anymore. Vanessa moved into a smaller apartment near Shadyside and returned to full-time work quietly. Fewer social events, fewer luxury dinners, fewer performances, more reality. Preston thought about her less often now. That surprised him. Not because he stopped caring entirely, because eventually, exhaustion finished processing what heartbreak started. One afternoon in early May, Preston met Evelyn Shaw for coffee downtown to finalize the last outstanding restructuring paperwork connected to Holloway Fine Furniture. The cafe overlooked Market Square, where businessmen hurried between office towers carrying laptops and expensive impatience. Evelyn reviewed the final documents while drinking black espresso. "Everything's stabilized," she said. "Payment structures are functioning. No defaults." Preston nodded once. "Good." Evelyn closed the folder. "You know you could have ruined them financially." "I know. You still don't seem angry enough about that." Preston looked out the window toward passing traffic. "I was angry." Past tense. He considered the question carefully, then answered honestly. "I think I confused responsibility with love for a long time." Evelyn studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "That's one of the more intelligent things you've ever said." Preston almost smiled. High praise from Evelyn. The waitress arrived with the check, but Evelyn pushed it away immediately. "My turn. You billed me enough already." Occupational hazard. They stood outside afterward beneath warm spring air, moving through Market Square. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Evelyn asked quietly, "What are you going to do now that nobody's drowning around you?" The question stayed with Preston long after they parted ways, because for years his identity revolved around holding things together. Systems, debts, families, crises. Without constant pressure, he finally had room to discover who he was outside survival. That realization felt both peaceful and unsettling. A week later, Vanessa called unexpectedly. Preston almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But eventually he answered. "Hey." Her voice sounded softer now, less polished. "Hi." A pause followed. "I heard about your promotion," she said. "News travels." "My dad talks about you differently now." Preston leaned against the hospital rooftop railing, where he'd been reviewing maintenance reports. "That's nice." Another silence. Then Vanessa said quietly, "I wanted to thank you properly." He looked out across the city skyline. "You already apologized. This isn't the same thing." "No, it wasn't." Apologies acknowledged pain. Gratitude acknowledged sacrifice. That difference mattered. Vanessa continued carefully. "I spent years thinking value looked loud, expensive, impressive." Preston listened, without interrupting. "And the whole time," she said softly, "the strongest person I knew was carrying everyone without needing attention for it." Wind moved across the rooftop around him. Below, ambulances rolled through traffic toward emergency entrances, where other exhausted people waited for someone reliable to keep things functioning. Finally, Preston answered. "I wasn't perfect either." "I know. I should have stopped pretending silence fixed everything." Vanessa exhaled quietly through the phone. "Maybe we both learned too late. Maybe. But not entirely too late. People still alive still had time to become better versions of themselves." That counted for something. Before ending the call, Vanessa asked one final question. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me completely?" Preston looked toward the city again. Bridges, steel, movement. Pittsburgh surviving the same way it always had. Slowly, honestly. Then he answered, with the only truth he had left. "I think I already did. I just couldn't stay." Vanessa cried quietly after that. Not dramatically. Not manipulatively. Just grief finally arriving without defenses attached to it. When the call ended, Preston remained on the rooftop several minutes longer watching evening sunlight settle across the city. Then he went back downstairs, back to work, back to systems depending on him. Later that night, Preston sat alone in the hospital observation cafeteria, eating from the same old plastic lunch container, while sunset burned orange against downtown glass towers. A younger technician walked past and nodded respectfully. "Night, boss." Preston nodded back. Simple, normal, peaceful. No one in the room knew about the debt, or the divorce, or the years of hidden sacrifice. And strangely enough, that finally felt okay. Because Preston Woods no longer needed people to misunderstand him correctly. He only needed to understand himself honestly. Outside the giant cafeteria windows, Pittsburgh glowed quietly beneath the coming night, while Preston finished his coffee in complete calm for the first time in years. Sometimes the quietest people in a room are carrying the heaviest weight. Preston never looked powerful. He didn't speak like a motivational speaker or walk into rooms demanding attention. But while everyone else focused on appearances, he focused on responsibility. And in the end, responsibility outlasted image. A lot of people watching this probably know what it feels like to give everything without being fully seen. Maybe you helped family members who later forgot your sacrifices. Maybe you stayed calm while holding together situations nobody else could survive. The hardest part about being reliable is that people eventually mistake your strength for something automatic. If this story connected with you, tell me honestly in the comments, have you ever realized someone's true value only after losing them? Or have you ever been the person quietly carrying everyone else? And if you enjoy stories about patience, truth, and the hidden strength behind ordinary people, subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow's story might hit even closer to home.